Hi, welcome. We're in week 8, wrapping up quarter 1 of US History Honors, our concurrent class. Okay, so I'm going to go over this week's lesson, just do an overview, and then also just make sure you're aware of what assignments are still open and when everything is closing because it's quarter 1 or the end of quarter 1. So technically the quarter's over 10/6, but everything is going to close on 10/3. Okay, so it's next Tuesday. And the reason for that is so I can get grades in. All right. So if you're trying to bring up your grade, trying to get anything in and stuff, just please keep that in mind for next week. That is a hard deadline. Okay. So let's go over this week's assignments. So again, the best place to kind of look to keep yourself organized is going to be going to modules, going to the weekly live session instruction page. This has a list of just, what is due. And stuff. So this week we are doing Module 1, Lesson 7, Art, Society, and Zeitgeist, okay, which is kind of the modern culture trend movement. And as we get into the lesson, that'll make more sense, all right? It also lists, so the checking for understanding, doing the notebook, and then the assessment, the quiz, which would be due this Friday, the 29th, okay? Some things that are still open. Module 1, Lesson 5, the checking for understanding, notebook, and quiz, those are open until this Friday, okay? So good opportunity to get some work in, especially make sure that you're doing the assessments, right? Anything summative is really going to help your grade, okay? And then from last week, women's suffrage movement, there was a worksheet and an essay. Again, the summative assignments are really helpful. That is going to close on 10/3, okay? So, and it will not reopen because final grades are due. So please make sure that you're monitoring that, okay, and getting your work in. All right, so we are in Module 1, Lesson 7. And I'll just kind of walk you through, make sure that you kind of have an idea of what you need to do. All right, so you can see 3 things due this week. There's the checking for understanding, okay, which those are really helpful in that they help you review for the quiz, right? Okay, so they're literally quizzes, or they're literally questions that you see from the test bank. So really worth your time. You can do it as many times you need to get the right answer. The notebook, which you'll do as you go through the lesson, and then the assessment, okay? So we're gonna start on the notebook page. You're gonna click on open, right? To open up the notebook, make a copy. You wanna save that to your Google Drive, make it shareable there in the right-hand corner. And then you can see the sections that need to be filled in, okay? And remember, we do this as we go through the notebook. So let's go back over into Canvas. We go through the lesson. Okay, the goal is to interpret events from various historical and cultural perspectives throughout the 20th century, so that'd be 1900s, using relevant information from multiple sources. So the key question that we're looking at is, how does the spirit of the time shape our view of historical and current events? For sure, the way one era is viewed compared to another, the times we're in shape the past, right? Or shape our view, I should say, of the past. So the times we're in and the current cultural trends, what's okay today, we might look back on something that was okay 50 years ago, and we might actually look back on it with judgment and say, no, it's not okay. Maybe terminology used, laws, the way we view a group, or habits, or philosophies, or religions, or views, so just because there was a view of the past doesn't mean that view is shared. And sometimes our view of the present and how we currently view that topic and stuff would be very different, can shape how we see history. And sometimes we see history in a lighter sense, and sometimes we see history harsher, than maybe things were at the time. So it is a good thing to remember that our current biases, or our current way of seeing things, sometimes we have to be careful how we judge the past, as far as how hard are we on them, what were the trends of their time. But this all does shape our views and our cultural norms. Okay, so you're going to take that supporting question, you're going to copy and paste it, and you're going to put it here in the supporting question. Then we're going to go to key vocab. And this is then where you'll put in the context clue, and then you define it in your own terms. So 5 terms. Intolerance, for instance, in the decade of the 1920s, known as by several different names, the Jazz Age, the Age of Intolerance, the Roaring 20s, which is kind of reference that anything goes. There was definitely counterculture, right? The Harlem Renaissance, okay? So there's a lot of different references for this decade, and maybe depending on if you're looking at it from music, if you're looking at it from religious versus non-religious, or different racial groups or cultural norms, okay, the way that that decade was defined. In some cases, religious groups were very, very, very intolerant. Drinking was really frowned upon, okay, and stuff. And actually we had prohibition, right? But then in the same breath, you have a very loose culture about going out and speakeasies and, dancing all night and drinking the night away and stuff. So very counter cultures to one another, sometimes happening at the same time. And if you think about it, we could probably even see some of those trends in our society today. Quintessential, okay, all of these events quintessentially define the era, which is why it gained the name the Roaring 20s, because there was just so much change. There was so much polar opposites of how people viewed things. The music got louder, the rhythms got better, and the extremes of either partaking or not partaking in certain lifestyles and stuff, or fashions or modesty or not, and the way that things were viewed, and stuff definitely amped up. Generations. So each generation, sees things differently, right? There's characteristics of each generation. How my generation, I'm 40 now, how my generation, how we view on maybe a certain trend or a social issue or something like that, often is different from the next generation, which would be yours. Usually they consider generation about 20 to 30 years, so the idea of the next, having children and stuff like that. So in 20 years, you'll be the older generation and the younger generation will see things differently than you. And sometimes they agree and sometimes they conflict. So that's why sometimes in the same era, you'll see very polarizing or different beliefs or trends or of what is acceptable, maybe depending on which generation you're looking at through their view. Manifestation. So being in the Gita inhabits the ability to clearly understand how its manifestations will affect the future. So manifestation, okay? So often how one decade sees it, so you're the younger generation right now, the way that you see things once you're voting and you're working and you're buying homes and you're having kids and you're, kind of getting into kind of the mid part of your life, the beliefs you have now will manifest in a different way than, say, my generation, based on the realities and the things that are important to you. And Zekists, okay, as seen through the observation of history, all people are framed by those movements, how we view society, how we view the past, and what we want for the future. Okay, so you put the context clue, kind of the reference that it's being used in, which you can literally copy it from the slide, and then you put it in your own words as well. In section 2. Okay, let's go to the next. Okay, so what does the concept of Zekitis mean? Okay, so the American Zekitis refers to the spirit of the time through history, culture, religion, politics, and social trends. Throughout the history of the United States, several eras have been defined by certain characteristics of an age or generation. So for instance, the 1920s, very, very distinctive. The 1940s, the World War II and going to war, coming home from the war. The 1960s, with the civil rights movement, with Woodstock, and, there's really strong movements in music and the way, marijuana and other things are viewed in the 60s and that generation, the baby boomer, so to speak. My dad definitely is a 1960s kid, and stuff. The music, civil rights movement, really big in the 1960s. So sometimes you have important movements happening at the same time, and sometimes they intersect. 1920s, 1960s, we can definitely see that. 1940s, with the war and coming out of the war, for sure. In this section, let's take a look at the notebook. So in your own words, define American Zegitist. Comparing, so again, the importance of this is just oftentimes there's multiple movements in one decade. And oftentimes they are fringe movements, meaning they're pushing the norm of society, and you see the norms of society change. So when movements often first start, they are minority movements, right? They don't have a lot of following. But with momentum, and oftentimes in a younger generation pushing them, they progress and they become a main movement. And sometimes movements are polar opposites of each other. So it is the conflict of the movements that grows the movements because people choose sides. Or sometimes they are movements that then can feed into each other or become definitive of that decade. Okay, so in this next section, the Roaring 20s, taking a look at some of those movements, what defined it. If you've ever heard, Flapper, the type of Art Deco, the Harlem Renaissance, big African-American cultural movement, especially happening throughout the East Coast, in New York and outside of New York and Chicago and things like that. Jazz music really growing, speakeasies, but also then counter movements like prohibition and modesty and real religious trends and stuff. So oftentimes, sometimes they're going with each other or they're counters of each other. Make sure you watch this video. Okay, so it'll definitely help give you information for that. And then once you've read through, watch that video, then you go through in your own, compare and contrast the modernist and traditional views of the 1920s. There were definitely very countercultures at the time. One saying, if you showed your ankle, it was too much, no red lipstick, long hair, no alcohol. The other, skirt up to the knee, short hair, red lip, drinking is fine, very counter movements. How did the mass consumers define this era? What factors contributed this? So coming out of World War I, mass production, factories and stuff is a whole new thing. So therefore, driving down the price, also the concept of consumer debt. Today, debt is very normal to us. Back then, people, if you didn't have the money, you didn't do it. So you just didn't. There was no buy now, pay later concept. So that was a new concept. So a lot of people got things that they couldn't necessarily afford. But because of that, more people had more things. But it drove the debt culture, which led then to the Depression right in the 30s. How would you describe the American zeitgeist of the 1920s? So you can kind of describe what that looks like. Okay. So just some examples on, and again, using that support on the Canvas page. The next page is going to be the baby boomers. So these are, my dad is a baby boomer. So these are people born after World War II. So people were coming back from war. There was a huge boom of children because soldiers are coming back from war. People are excited to see them. You can put 2 and 2 together, lots of babies, okay? But it was also a cultural movement, all right, coming out of World War II, a boom in the job market. A lot of people had bills to go to, when I say bill, I mean scholarships to go to college, GI Bill coming out of the military. So the concept of suburbia, moving out of the cities, everyone had an automobile and just the suburban life starts, so late 1940s, 50s, the whole living in the suburbs became kind of the new American dream or the new era and stuff like that. And probably more your grandparents, some of my parents are a part of that era. So again, reading about it, okay, what defines that era, watching a good video, it'll kind of summarize, here is the zeitgeist of that era, what was most defining of that era, okay, the extremes, and truly characterize that era. And then what was a baby boomer, okay? Why did America experience a baby boomer? I think I kind of gave you, soldiers coming back from war, people are excited to see them. You could put 2 and 2 together, 9 months later, whatever, big boom. How do mass consumerism, how did the GI Bill contribute to the growth of the suburbs? So people going to college, qualifying for better jobs, getting better jobs, being able to commute, the commuter lifestyle really started to change. And how would you describe the American zeitgeist post-World War II era? So watching that video and look for some of those characteristics. Okay, sorry, I thought I was on this page. So I just went over those 3 questions in number 5. Okay, then you're going to look at the next, right? You just go through this as you're going through. So counterculture, 1960s is really defined by counterculture. So it's taking what was accepted and it's challenging it. And we see this with Woodstock. We see this with civil rights movement. We see this with women's movement and things like that. So the pressing of what is the view on drugs? What is the view on the war in Vietnam? What is the view on the Cold War? What is the view on racial relations and laws and things like that? So there's a lot of counterculture movements that, when I say counterculture, I mean what the norm of the time was and then pushing the norm. So when we think of the 1960s, you think of changing the norms, challenging the norms, changing the traditions, challenging the traditions, and seeing things in a different way, seeing things in a progressive way, in a totally different light. And then that really gaining momentum. So in the early 60s, slowly gaining momentum as more fringe movements, and by the end of the 1960s becoming more, again, popular culture or more the norm cultures and beliefs of America. And a lot of the younger generations pushing that, sorry. So again, reading through this, watching the video, what were these movements? How did they gain momentum? And maybe in what ways did they intersect? But a lot of counterculture movements, again, changing the norms, challenging the norms, and not always smoothly in the 1960s, for sure. So how did hippies represent the view of counterculture? So what was the view of kind of the hippie? The protest movement. So protesting became really big. And not that there hasn't been protests in the past, but we definitely see when we see like the best examples or we see it pushed to a whole new level, definitely the 1960s sets a whole new example of protest compared to before that. Why did the youth of the 1960s hold different political beliefs than their parents? Because I think a lot of their parents, these are the young baby boomers coming up. My dad is a child of the 60s, so seeing things differently than their parents, who a lot of them, fought in World War II, lived at home during World War II, went through the Great Depression, so went through one of the worst financial crises and now a huge world war, are going to see things differently than youth who have been raised not in that environment, outside of that. So definitely your life experiences shape how you see that. So sometimes when I look at younger generations, I need to give some grace of maybe I don't agree with them, but what they've experienced, how they see things, or the older generations, oh, they're traditional. Oh, but what did they live through? What did they live through that shaped their views that are maybe different than mine? Because a lot of our views come from life experiences, maybe our family history, the state we're in, or major world events. I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened, and it totally it defined my 20s with how I viewed America, how I viewed the military, how I viewed threats to America and stuff like that, versus younger generations see 9/11 and maybe see things a little bit differently. Life experiences shape, for sure, or have a huge impact on the lens with which we see things, or kind of guiding what's important to us or how we view certain topics sometimes, versus not having experience with it, and with time, for sure. And there's good and bad to both. I'm not trying to defend or trying to say one is right or the other. Things happen in your generation. Your generation's interaction and incorporation of social media, right, is such, you've been fully raised with it. It didn't really hit until my late teens, 20s. And that's a huge part of shaping you. And there's pros and cons to that, right? Maybe too much information, a lot of misinformation makes it easy to jump on something without always knowing, you know what I mean? But you also have access to information in a way that my generation never did when we were your age. Okay, so we're going to look at the primary source. So remember, this is something that directly relates to the topic and stuff. So this one is Harlem rent parties, okay? So about kind of pushing back or looking at the issue of the Harlem Renaissance, okay? So skimming through this, all right, and then you're going to fill out the chart. So title, pull the title of the article. So that's going to be Harlem Rent Parties, Frank Bird's narrative, 1938. Concept or unit, so you can pull what the unit is, which is the Art Society and American Zeitgeist. And you go from there. So what's unique about this is a first-hand account, right? Any primary source can be a first-hand account on the lesson or the topic. Look for any words that maybe are kind of different to you. Now it's 10 pages. So if you want to skim through, maybe like, on the second page, the 6th page, the 8th page, take a little summary of that page. What is this about? Okay. And summarize, what were these Harlem rent parties? Okay. What was important to them? Why were they a big deal for the time? Okay. Once you're done with that, then you're going to start to wrap things up, okay? Looking at the journal, kind of pulling the concept together, considering all the events that have occurred in the last few years. So in this case, the last few years, so think in the last 5-6 years. So think maybe a year or two before COVID on, think how COVID is definitely going to be a part of ours, right? It's not just an illness and a pandemic, right? But think culturally what it did to us. Think about the movements, think about the different feelings toward masks, toward vaccinations, toward limitations. Should we or should we not have had that? Should we have shut down? Should we not have? Were we shut down for too long? The different views, were we too fast with it, or were we not fast enough? What was effective, what wasn't? And it did create, again, very counter movements and counter cultures in some ways, right? That ingrained a separation, but also created moral beliefs, right, that people held. I feel like we're calming down now a little bit. Everybody's kind of calming down a little bit, and on that we don't have to argue so much. But let's be honest, the divisions and the different opinions. And again, if you think of like the 1920s, the prohibition, no drinking versus sneaking out and drinking and dancing and being as, counterculture as possible. In the same way, we can draw that similar analogy of, right, of how, for just one of the things you could talk about. I mean, you could talk about other things as well, but that's a good one to kind of think about. Okay, then you're going to do the review, the checking for understanding. All right, this is really good for reviewing your use of key terms from the lesson. And then summarizing, okay? How does the spirit of the time shape our historical, our view of historical and current events? It's interesting how we view the pandemic. How will it be talked about in 20 years when the pandemic is written into history books? If I'm still teaching history in 20 years, what will that look like? Right? What will that look like versus, let's say, in 50 years when the person teaching it wasn't actually alive and lived through the pandemic? It's interesting. I probably teach 9/11 very differently than someone who didn't live through 9/11, right? When you have firsthand or was really young, when you have firsthand experience and it's very much like in your face and a huge impact in your life versus when it's something you just read about, you barely remember it, right? You're going to have a different reaction. You're going to have a different point of view and stuff. My grandma lived through, she was a teenager when Pearl Harbor happened. And I remember her telling me they thought that, like it was the end of the United States and it was so traumatic and stuff. And now we look back, yes, and it triggered our involvement in World War II. And we talk about it more from like a large scale, direct attack on us, but how it brought us into the war, where when she talked about it, it was so emotional. Because again, it was so scary. They didn't know what was going on. Now they're at war, and like hearing her account and then my emotional connection to it, totally different. She lived through it. I read about it, right? And when she died, it made me sad because it was like, oh gosh, when you get those firsthand accounts of these major world events, often negative, it's so impactful to help you appreciate the severity of something when you get that firsthand account. And as you lose those things and as time moves on, right, we become kind of numb to them. They lose some of their effectiveness, I feel like, when you don't have those firsthand accounts. And that could be of any major thing that happens, in culture and society and in shaping culture and society, right? Firsthand account definitely makes things personal in a totally different way. Okay, so make sure you do that checking for understanding. Make sure that you get that notebook done, turn it in, and then take the assessment, okay? Oh, while I'm on here, let's make sure that I've got it set for 2. I think I need to go in and do that because remember you get 2 attempts. So I'll just do that right now. It is set for 2 attempts. Okay, so it's set for 2 attempts. So please, it'll keep the higher of the 2. All right, so highly encourage you, if you do well in the first one, doesn't hurt to try it again unless you get a perfect score and stuff to get as good a grade as possible, okay? And then remember, you can go to the announcements. And again, just like I have in the lesson and recording page, then there's gonna have that list of what's due this week and then what's still open and due, okay? As always, feel free to email me. You can come by on my Wednesdays between 4 and 5 and ask questions. I'm happy to help. All right, thank you so much.